Darius Cole didn't move when Ethan Whitmore said it. "Stay where you belong." His voice slicing through the glass-walled room as every executive turned to stare at her like she'd already crossed a line she couldn't come back from. One more step, and she'd lose the only job keeping her afloat. One more word, and she'd expose a mistake that could cost him millions. The air felt cold against her skin, the marble floor stealing the heat from her heels, but her chest burned, because she knew something no one else in that room did. Ethan's pen hovered over the contract, seconds from signing. No one questioned him. No one ever did. But Darius stepped forward anyway, breath steady, heart breaking, not realizing this was the moment that would change everything between them forever. The apartment was quiet, too quiet for someone who spent most of her days cleaning other people's mess. The light flickered above her again. Darius wiped her hands on the faded towel that never quite dried. Her fingers sore from scrubbing at the stains that refused to come out. It was almost midnight. She'd been working since 6 a.m., her stomach hollow and growling in a way that reminded her it hadn't been fed in hours. But still, she couldn't stop. The dirty dishes piled high in the corner, the stack of bills marked urgent. They weren't going to clean themselves. Not like the way she had to. Not with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned long ago that the world didn't give you grace unless you earned it. And sometimes, even then, it didn't. Darius stood there, the sink water running cold against her skin, listening to the hum of the fridge. The light above her buzzed again, flickering, and she caught her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, an old hoodie, and her hands shaking ever so slightly as she pulled a can of beans from the shelf. It was all she could afford tonight. One meal. Another day of empty stomachs. Another night with the same worn shoes. The same dreams put on hold. But that didn't matter, not now, not anymore. The ones who counted on her, her little brother, her mother, needed her to stay strong. Needed her to keep that small piece of pride that they still hadn't taken from her. Outside, the wind howled, the air sharp as ice, the kind of cold that could cut through to your bones if you stood in it long enough. Darius pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help. She knew this part of life. The part where you just kept moving, even when it felt like the weight of everything was about to crush you. Even when the rent was late, the car wouldn't start, and every door you knocked on seemed to close before you could even get a word out. But there was still the warmth, somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her from giving up. The way she'd held a dying plant in her window for 3 months, coaxing it back to life with nothing more than the smallest of touches and the belief that even something broken could still bloom. The way she'd helped the old man down the street with his groceries, even though she couldn't afford her own lunch. And the way she'd smiled at Ethan Whitmore every morning when he barely noticed, just to remind herself that she wasn't invisible, not entirely. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was something. She reached for the beans, her fingers brushing against the worn tin, the sound of it cracking open a quiet promise she'd made to herself long ago. Stay. Stay and fight. Stay and do the things no one else would. Because dignity was something no one could take from her, no matter how small her world was, no matter how small her meals. The flickering light buzzed again. Darius let the sound fill the silence, the emptiness around her, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt it. That quiet, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she had more to give than anyone ever realized. The Whitmore estate loomed like a fortress, its high iron gates shutting out the world behind them. The driveway stretched for miles, the marble pillars gleaming under the sun. Darius had been inside this house 100 times, but it never felt any less like another planet. The crisp, chilled air of the early morning was a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the polished marble floors she walked on. She moved silently through the halls, passing guests dressed in suits and gowns, their laughter echoing through the open spaces, filling the rooms like the scent of expensive perfume. They didn't notice her. They never did. The guests at the gala hardly spared a glance at the staff, their eyes locked on the polished crystal glasses in their hands, the glistening food spread out on silver trays. Darius, dressed in a simple black uniform, moved swiftly among them, a ghost in the background. She saw their faces, smiling, aloof, so sure of their place in the world. But their eyes, when they flickered toward her, were always the same, distant, impersonal. They had no reason to care. To them, she wasn't a person. She was part of the background, the service. Her purpose here was to stay invisible. A waiter brushed past her, his tray of champagne flutes clinking together, a polite "excuse me" escaping his lips as if it was an automatic response, one he gave without thinking. The guests hardly noticed. Their conversations were filled with names she didn't recognize, deals she couldn't imagine, their voices smooth and practiced, their words dripping with power. She kept her head down, focusing on the path ahead, taking the tray of empty glasses, stacking them quietly. The chandelier above cast a harsh light, its crystals reflecting the faintest glint off her worn shoes. Ethan Whitmore stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by a crowd, laughing, commanding the attention of everyone in his orbit. He was the center of everything. His tall frame cutting through the crowd, his deep voice carrying across the room like it was meant to be heard by all. But when his gaze briefly met hers, there was no recognition, no warmth. His eyes slid over her, as if she was just another piece of the staff. No one cared to stop and think about her, to ask her name. Not in this house, not in this world. And it wasn't just the guests. It was the whole house, the way the floors creaked under the weight of its emptiness, the grandness that was more cold than inviting, the way the art on the walls seemed to mock her every time she walked by. Nothing about this place was meant for someone like her. She didn't belong here. She knew that. Yet, there she was, watching from the edges, waiting to serve the very people who had no idea of the cost of their comfort. Ethan didn't look her way again. He wasn't interested in a maid's life. Not her life. He was a man of wealth, of power, of influence. She was just someone in the background, disposable, unimportant. A moment passed, and Darius felt it, like a sharp, cold gust of wind in the room. This was the world she existed in now. A place of power where no one noticed her, where she was nothing but a shadow in a sea of light. Darius felt the room shift the moment she stepped forward, her tray of empty glasses suddenly feeling heavier than before. Ethan Whitmore stood in the center of the room, the crowd buzzing around him like a swarm of bees. She had been moving around the edges of his world for years now, never intruding, always staying quiet. But this time it was different. Something shifted in her stomach, a knot that tightened with every passing second. She hadn't meant to, but when she overheard the conversation, his voice sharp, dismissive, cutting through the air like a blade, she couldn't stay silent anymore. The deal he was about to sign could cost the company millions, and yet he was blind to the smallest detail buried in the fine print. She knew what it meant. She knew what was at stake. She had to act. Her breath caught as she approached the table, where Ethan was surrounded by a few board members, all nodding along as he confidently ran through the details of the merger. He looked every bit the billionaire, perfectly tailored suit, sharp jawline, exuding power in the way he carried himself. But there was something in the way he spoke, in the way the others laughed along with him, that made Darius feel like she was suffocating. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a game of control, and in this game she didn't matter. She wasn't even supposed to be here. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that she couldn't unsee what was happening. It was right there in the contract, the clause that slipped by unnoticed, the one that would have put all the blame for a failed merger squarely on the shoulders of the company, Ethan's company. It was a trap, carefully hidden in the language, waiting to be exploited. She could see it clear as day. And yet, no one in the room seemed to care. No one except her. Her heart pounded as she approached the table, her footsteps careful but deliberate. She had a choice. She could remain silent, keep her head down, and let them make the mistake. Or she could risk everything and speak up. She stopped just behind them, her tray now empty in her hands, and opened her mouth. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but enough to draw his attention. The room fell silent. Ethan turned, his gaze narrowing as he studied her for a moment, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Darius?" he asked, his tone cold, dismissive. He didn't even bother to look at her fully, his attention already shifting back to the document on the table. She could feel the weight of his words in the air, the distance, the power. She was nothing to him, just the maid, just the staff. Yet here she was speaking out of turn. I believe there's an issue with the clause on page 14, Darius said, her voice steadier than she felt. It shifts all the liability to Hale Investments. If the merger fails, your company takes the full hit, not Vaughn Global. It's a trap. The room was dead silent. No one spoke. Darius felt every pair of eyes on her, their judgment hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. She knew what this could mean, what it would mean. She was a maid. She wasn't supposed to speak in these rooms, wasn't supposed to challenge the decisions of the people who owned everything she could never have. Ethan's expression twisted into something unreadable, his eyes flicking to the paper in his hands. The pause that followed felt like an eternity. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the tension building. Darius's hands tightened around the tray, her knuckles turning white. What did you say? Ethan's voice was low now, like a growl. His gaze locked onto her, and for the first time in years, Darius felt like she was truly seen, truly noticed, but not in a way that made her feel powerful. No, this was different. This was the kind of attention that made her feel small, insignificant, like an intruder. I said it's a trap, she repeated, her voice firmer now, despite the fear tightening in her chest. It's disguised as a protection clause, but it's not. If you sign this, your company's going to take the fall. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And then, like a crack in the stillness, the laughter from across the room echoed in the silence. Derek Vaughn, one of the executives, leaned back in his chair, a smug grin on his face. Are we really giving weight to conspiracy theories from someone who polishes door handles? He scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. The insult stung, sharp and sudden, but Darius didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now. Not when everything was at risk. She stood her ground, meeting Ethan's gaze, feeling the weight of the moment. Security? Ethan's voice cut through the tension, sharp and final. Escort her out. Her heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. The risk she had taken. She had done what she thought was right, but it was clear now. It wasn't her place to be here, to speak, to interfere. She was just the maid. As the security guard stepped toward her, Darius held her breath, her chest tight. This was the moment that could ruin everything. She could leave quietly, slip back into the shadows where she belonged, or she could stay, and force them to see her, to acknowledge her. She chose the latter, her feet planted firmly as she stood there, waiting. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the moment that would change everything. Darius's breath caught as the security guard reached for her arm, the room suddenly spinning with pressure. The sharp, cold air in the room felt like a weight against her chest. Ethan's words sliced through the tension like a blade. Get her out of here. The command was clear, final. Darius didn't move. She couldn't. She couldn't just walk away from this. Her legs were trembling, her heart pounding, but she had to stand her ground. If she left now, they would never take her seriously. Never. Not that they did before. But this time she had to make them see her. The guard's grip tightened around her arm, forcing her to move. It was as if the entire room had turned against her. The whispered voices, the judging eyes. It felt like the weight of the world was crashing down on her. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room burning into her skin, the contempt, the disbelief, the judgment. Ethan, you can't be serious, one of the board members said, a thin, condescending smile curling at the corner of his lips. Are you really going to let her talk to us like that? His voice was dripping with sarcasm, mocking her. Darius's chest tightened. She wanted to shout back, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. She was just a maid. They all knew it. She had no right to be here, no right to speak, no right to challenge him. She was nothing, but she wasn't nothing anymore. Not after this, not after risking everything. She tried to pull away from the guard's grip, but he held her firm, pushing her toward the door. The entire room was watching. Every movement felt like it was under a microscope. You really think you can stop this deal? Ethan's voice was cold, like ice. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. The distance between them felt vast, but the anger in his gaze made the space seem even wider. Do you even understand what you're talking about? You're just the help. Stay in your place. The words hit her harder than she expected. They were the words she had heard before, over and over again, from people who never saw her as anything more than a shadow in their world. But now it was different. Ethan Whitmore had said it. He had looked at her, really looked at her, and dismissed her completely. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rapid, painful rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence that followed. The guard didn't let go, his hand pressing harder against her arm, forcing her closer to the door. I just wanted to help, Darius whispered, the words barely escaping her lips, but they were there. She couldn't take them back. They were her truth. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She wasn't trying to destroy his deal. She had only wanted to protect them, to stop a disaster before it happened. But now everything was falling apart. Her job, her dignity, everything she had worked for. Ethan's eyes flicked to the guard, a silent command, and the guard began to push her harder, guiding her out of the room. The board members' eyes followed her, cold, uninterested, like she was some nuisance they just wanted to be rid of. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The laughter from moments before seemed like a distant memory. All that remained was the harsh, cutting silence of judgment. She stumbled, her shoes skidding on the floor as she was forced backward, out of the room. She could feel the sting of the cold air from the hallway, and her mind raced, a whirlwind of confusion and anger. She had never felt so small, so powerless. She had never felt like such an outsider. The moment she had stepped into this house, she had known she didn't belong. But this was worse than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just being invisible. This was being rejected, stripped of her humanity, like she was nothing more than an object to be discarded. The door to the hallway swung open with a force that made her flinch, and the guard shoved her forward, her feet stumbling over the threshold. She didn't even try to stop herself. The tears threatened to rise, but she swallowed them back. She wasn't going to cry. Not now. Not when she had come this far. The hallway was cold, dark, and silent. The sound of the door slamming behind her the only noise in the space. It echoed, a reminder of everything she had just lost. She was alone now, completely alone. She looked up at the security guard, his face impassive as he stood there, watching her with disinterest. She wasn't sure if he even saw her as a person anymore. To him, she was just another part of the staff, just another task to manage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not to him, but to herself. She didn't even know why she said it. What was there to apologize for? She hadn't done anything wrong. She had only tried to help. But it didn't matter. It never did. The guard didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting for her to move, as if this was all just part of the routine. The humiliation burned in her chest, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to breathe. She had to keep it together. She had to stay strong. But the pressure was unbearable. Every inch of her felt like it was cracking, breaking. She could feel the weight of their words, of their dismissals, sinking deep into her bones. They had made her feel small, unworthy, like she didn't matter. And maybe she didn't. Not to them, not to Ethan. But maybe, just maybe, she mattered to herself. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let this break her. She couldn't. Not now. Not when there was still so much left to fight for. The guard stepped aside, and Darius walked down the hall, her steps slow but firm. The world outside those walls was waiting. It was cold. It was hard. But it was real. And it was hers. Her heart still raced, but now it wasn't out of fear. It was something else. Something more. Something that whispered in the back of her mind. "You can't stop now." Darius stood outside the massive gates of the Whitmore estate, the cool night air pressing against her skin. She hadn't left the building, hadn't walked more than a few steps before she stopped, feeling the weight of it all hit her. Her breath came slow, steady, the only sound in the quiet night. The city seemed miles away, swallowed up by the darkness. And she was alone in a world she wasn't sure she belonged to anymore. She looked up at the sky, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting the world in muted shadows. The air was crisp, biting, but it wasn't enough to numb the ache deep inside her. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but it was quieter now, slower, like it had found a rhythm of its own, steady and heavy. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, the kind of night that made you feel invisible. Her hands were still trembling from the moments before, the seconds when she had stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the door slamming behind her echoing in her mind, over and over again. That moment when the world shifted, when Ethan had looked at her like she didn't matter. But it wasn't just that. It was everything. It was the years of silent labor, of being unseen, of holding her tongue when every part of her screamed to say something, anything. And now she was here, standing at the edge of a world that had always been just out of reach. She could feel the faint warmth of the streetlights casting long shadows on the ground, but they didn't touch her. The chill in the air was different here, outside the walls of the estate. It was quieter. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of the wind moving through the trees. The world felt distant, almost unreal. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the crumpled piece of paper she had tucked there earlier. The contract, no, not just the contract. The reason she had spoken up in the first place. It had been about more than just the deal. It had been about the truth, about standing up, even if it had cost her everything. Darius closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. The air felt colder now, like it was seeping into her bones. The weight of the evening pressed against her chest. But there was something else too. Something that, despite everything, made her feel alive. She couldn't explain it. It was like a flicker in her chest, a spark. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something else entirely. Maybe it was freedom. Maybe it was the knowledge that, for the first time in a long time, she had taken control. Even if it had been small, even if it hadn't mattered to them, she mattered to herself. She opened her eyes, letting the cold air rush past her face. She felt the sharp sting of it, but she didn't pull away. She stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the night finally settling around her. The light flickered from a nearby street lamp, casting its pale glow on the sidewalk. The clouds above parted just enough for the moon to break through, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. It was small, but it was enough to see by. Enough to know that the world wasn't as dark as it had seemed a moment ago. Darius took one last look at the estate behind her, the towering gates, the distant lights, the quiet mansion that had seemed so big, so intimidating. And then, with a final breath, she turned away. She walked down the street, her steps slow, deliberate. The cold air didn't sting as much now. She could feel the night around her, the quiet hum of the city, and it felt like something was shifting, like she was finally moving forward. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel small. She felt real. And that was enough. It had to be. Darius didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were almost upon her. Her heart skipped a beat as she instinctively slowed her pace, the air around her suddenly heavy. She turned just in time to see Ethan Whitmore walking toward her, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked into his pockets. The faint light from the street lamp caught his face, casting long shadows that only made him seem more distant. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, unsure of what to expect. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. The city noise faded into a dull hum, the cold air pressing in between them like an unspoken distance. Darius couldn't read his face. Was this it? Was he about to say something else? Something even worse than before? She stood there, unsure, but determined not to back down, not to retreat. Not anymore. Ethan stopped a few feet away, looking at her in a way that made her stomach tighten. She braced herself for another cutting remark, for more dismissal, but instead, his voice was softer than she expected. You were right. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if she even believed him. She had been right. She knew she had been right all along. The clause in the contract, it had been a trap and she had caught it. But hearing him say it felt different somehow. Not like a victory, but more like a crack in the wall he had built around himself. You didn't have to do that, he continued, his voice steady but lacking the usual arrogance. You didn't have to speak up. You could have just stayed silent, done your job and walked away. He took a step closer, the cold air between them now thinner, the distance shrinking with every word. But you didn't. Darius swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to actually acknowledge what she had done. After everything, after the way he had treated her, she hadn't expected him to admit she was right. And yet, here he was, standing before her, no longer the untouchable billionaire he had been just hours ago. The walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to be crumbling, bit by bit. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to steady herself, trying to find her voice. I didn't do it for you, she said quietly, her voice more confident than she felt. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Ethan's eyes flickered briefly, a moment of something passing between them, something she couldn't quite place. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I know, he said, almost too quietly for her to hear. But you still did it. And that's more than I can say for most people. There was a pause, the weight of his words settling in the space between them. The sound of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves in the wind. All of it felt miles away now. All that remained was this moment, this shift. The power had changed hands in the briefest of exchanges, but it was real. Darius felt it. She could see it in his eyes, the recognition, the understanding, the shift. He hadn't just seen her as the maid anymore. He had seen her for what she was. Someone who would not be ignored, someone who would not back down, someone with integrity. The silence stretched out, and for the first time in a long time, Darius felt something inside her shift. She hadn't expected this moment, hadn't expected him to come after her, to admit that she had been right. She hadn't expected him to stand there face to face with her and say, why didn't you just let me handle it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he was trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. You could have stayed out of it. You could have stayed invisible. Darius shook her head, a small, almost sad smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Because that's not who I am, she said softly. And if I had stayed invisible, if I had stayed silent, I would have been complicit. I couldn't let that happen. Not to you. Not to anyone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, as though the very ground beneath their feet had shifted. Darius wasn't sure what had changed in Ethan. Maybe he was just seeing her for the first time. Maybe he had always known but hadn't been willing to acknowledge it. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that, in this moment, he wasn't the billionaire who had dismissed her earlier. He wasn't the man who had treated her like she didn't matter. In this moment, he was just a man, standing in front of her, finally seeing her. You're right, he said finally, his voice steady, though there was something different in it now. I wasn't listening before, but I am now. Darius nodded, her chest tight with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully process. She didn't know what this moment meant, what it would lead to, but she knew one thing. The power had shifted. It had moved from him to her. And for the first time in a long time, Darius felt like she was no longer invisible. She had been seen, and that was enough. Ethan turned to leave, his hand brushing against the doorframe as he stepped back into the house. He paused just before entering, his back to her. Thank you, he said, his voice barely audible, but it was there. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. She had already heard him. The twist wasn't just in the words he had said. It was in the way he said them. In the way he had seen her. For the first time, Ethan Whitmore wasn't just the billionaire, he was human. And Darius? She wasn't invisible anymore. Darius sat on the edge of the bench, her eyes fixed on the small park in front of her. The cool breeze brushed against her face, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and earth. A simple, calming reminder that life moved forward, regardless of what had happened the day before. Her fingers drummed lightly on her knee as she watched the children run by, their laughter echoing through the air. She hadn't expected it to feel like this, the quiet after the storm. The weight in her chest had lightened, but there was still a heaviness in the air, a quiet uncertainty she couldn't quite shake. It had been a few days since she'd last seen Ethan, since he had walked into her life with all the force of someone who thought he was untouchable, and walked out with something different. A recognition, a shift. He had apologized, though she hadn't asked for it. His voice, still carrying the remnants of the man he had been, was softer, more grounded. "I was wrong," he had said, his eyes meeting hers, with an honesty she hadn't expected. "And I should have listened. I'm sorry for everything." The apology hadn't come with grand gestures. No dramatic scene, no need for her to forgive him on the spot. It was simple, genuine, and that was enough. Darius had just nodded, her gaze steady, but she hadn't spoken. She didn't need to. What had happened, the words exchanged, the moments where the power had shifted, those were enough. She had held her dignity. She hadn't asked for more. Now, sitting in the park, she could feel the weight of it all, the tiredness, the ache in her bones, but also the lightness. It was a strange, comforting thing to realize that she didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders. She didn't have to fight for recognition anymore. She had always known her worth. Ethan, for all his arrogance, had seen it too. And now, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of being seen. Darius leaned back, her eyes drifting to the sky above, where the clouds were beginning to part, revealing a soft, golden light. The world was still big, and she was still small in it, but somehow it felt like it was hers again. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't defined by what others saw her as. She was more than that. The sound of footsteps pulled her back to the present, and she turned her head just as Ethan appeared in the distance, walking slowly towards her. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, just a simple jacket and jeans, his hands in his pockets. There was something different about him. Less guarded, more open, as if he had shed a layer of himself. He stopped a few feet away, not saying anything at first, just looking at her with a quiet acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice low. It wasn't an apology that begged for forgiveness. It wasn't an apology meant to fix anything. It was simply an acknowledgement of his mistake, and it was enough. Darius nodded, her eyes meeting his, steady and unflinching. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to make him feel better or to make herself feel better. The apology, the change, was real. That was enough. "I'm glad you spoke up," he added, his words coming more naturally now. "You did what I couldn't." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at him, allowing the silence to settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't awkward. It was just real. For the first time, they were two people who had seen each other for who they were. No more masks, no more roles to play. "You're right," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me, for what's right." Ethan didn't respond at first. Instead, he just stood there, taking in her words, the weight of them sinking in. And for the first time, Darius saw something in his eyes. A hint of respect, maybe, or understanding. Maybe even something more. "You don't need to explain yourself to me," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I understand now." Darius didn't smile, but there was a softness in her eyes. She knew. They both knew. Sometimes the things we do aren't for others. They're for us. And that was all she needed to know. The world could keep turning, with its power dynamics and its expectations, but she had found something in herself that no one could take away. The silence stretched on, but it was different now. Peaceful, content. Neither of them needed anything more than this. The apology had been made. The change had already begun. Darius stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and with one final glance at Ethan, she began to walk away. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world was hers again, and she was ready for it. Darius walked down the empty street, her footsteps steady but unhurried. The evening sky above had softened to shades of indigo, the last traces of daylight slipping away. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of yellow light on the pavement, stretching long shadows behind her. The sound of distant cars was muffled by the quiet, the city wrapped in a blanket of calm. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world was still there, still moving around her, but she felt something shift inside, like the weight of the day had finally lifted. She passed an old bookstore, its windows fogged, the dim light spilling out onto the sidewalk. For a moment, she paused, her hand resting on the cool glass. She could hear the faint rustling of pages turning inside, the soft, almost imperceptible hum of the world continuing without her. A gust of wind blew by, tugging at the hem of her jacket, but she didn't shiver. She breathed in deeply, the cool air filling her lungs, grounding her in this moment. The city was alive, the world was alive, and she was here. She let out a slow breath, her gaze lifting to the skyline. Quiet, still, yet full of possibility. And then, without a word, she continued walking, her figure slowly fading into the night, swallowed by the silence.